Today, I'm going to be answering one of the most common questions in deaf education today. And that question is, does this hard of hearing student need a sign language interpreter? I'm going to give you exactly what to look for to be able to answer this question, and then how to set your student up for success if they do or do not need an interpreter as your IEP team decides. So I'm going to be talking about two scenarios. The first scenario is the hard of hearing student who does not yet have an interpreter. And the question on the IEP team is, do they need one? The second question I'm going to be talking about today is the student who has an interpreter, but it does not appear as though they actually use this interpreter. So the question on the table is, do we pull the interpreter from the student? Yes or no? So, first of all, let me reframe this entire question because so often the question asked is, does the student need an interpreter? And that is not the question that we should be asking. The question that we should be asking is, does the student have access, full access to their education? We need to consider the true classroom environment. That means the classroom environment that has background noise, that has a teacher that moves around the classroom, that has kids that have discussion and answers all around the room. And we need to identify, does this hard of hearing student have access to all of it? Because all of it makes up their education. And do they have access through listening only? If they do not have 95% access through listening only, then we need to have the conversation. How do we get them access? The other question that we need to make sure that we are answering is, do they understand the education that is happening around them? Because even if they can repeat a sentence back to you exactly verbatim, that does not mean that they actually understand what's being asked of them. So therefore, they may be in the classroom and they may be nodding and you may be confident that they can hear everything that you are saying, but they may not understand any of it. And therefore, that means that they are not accessing their curriculum because their brain does not have the ability to actually intake the information, process it, make sense of it, and then learn from it. So question number one is, do they have access to their education through listening only? And if they don't, then we need to identify, how can we provide this access? Now, oftentimes I see teams that say, no, the student does not have access to their education. Therefore, we need to provide them an interpreter. And if that is the situation, then we need to make sure that we are setting the system up in place for your student to be successful with that interpreter. Required skill number one to be able to utilize a sign language interpreter to help your student access their curriculum and learn using the interpreter is they need to understand sign language. And I don't mean that they need to have the basics. They need to have a strong foundation in sign language. Now, this does not have to be American Sign Language ASL. It can be a signed exact English or a Pidgin, a conceptually signed language, but they need to be able to understand in sign language, and even better, that they can communicate back in sign language. So often I see schools put a sign language interpreter in front of the student and expect that student to learn sign language strictly by having that person there. And that just does not happen. We actually need to set in place systems for that student to learn the language. So I like to give you a little example. Here's my example. Let's pretend that we give you a television show, a newscast. You're supposed to be learning this information on the newscast. And then let's pretend I turn on the caption and I put the captions on a foreign language for you. And then I turn the volume, which you understand the language of, but I turn it down to a low setting so that it's hard for you to listen to. So we've got a soft setting for the news, and then I've got Chinese caption going for you. And I expect you to learn Chinese through these Chinese captions that are on the TV for you. What are you going to do? You are not going to lean in and start learning the Chinese captions. What you are going to do is you are going to lean in and work really hard to understand what's being said. And the captions, you may figure out a word or two, but being on the screen is not going to teach you to be fluent. What you would need is you would actually need a language class that it would be teaching you this language so that when you are seeing it in action, you can make those associations and even opportunities for that language to be pre-taught to you, be taught in isolation so that when you see it on the screen, then you've got that foundation, that ability to be able to recognize it. But even better, if you are fluent in Chinese ahead of time, then we can add those Chinese captions and you'll be able to access what's happening on the news that much better. So often we do something like that for our hard of hearing students. We just expect them to learn sign language by it being placed in front of them. And that is not how they learn. They're going to need intentional, direct instruction on this language, and it needs to happen on a daily basis. Now, how can this happen? A teacher of the deaf can do it. You can sign them up for sign language classes. There's lots of virtual options to do that. You could have a deaf person come in who signs with them and just build that conversational language first. There are lots of ways to be able to build in this ability to understand sign language that will support the use of an interpreter. But if you don't build in those structures, then I guarantee you that interpreter is going to be a mismatch. And that is so often what I see. Okay, so we just talked about identifying if a student needs a sign language interpreter. The question actually is, do they have access to their curriculum, to their education through listening only? And if the answer is no, then we need to identify how are we going to provide them that access. So a sign language interpreter is an option if you are able to build in those additional skills so that they can learn sign language. That resource, that tool is useful to them. Other options include the use of captioning. But if we put the use of captioning in place, we need to make sure that they've got a strong reading level so that they are able to read and understand those captions. We also want to consider having the captions as a universal design so that everybody in the class is accessing them, so that it is a support service that can help support your student. They can still see the overall class, and then they can also watch the captions along with everybody. But if you provide captions, you still need to teach your student how to utilize the captions again. So they're not just there moving, but that the student knows and recognizes how and when to use them as a support. The next option, if your student is not accessing the curriculum through auditory access only, and you determine that a sign language interpreter is not appropriate and neither are captions, the next thing that you need to consider is actually moving them into an environment that is a quiet environment that provides direct instruction. Because in a noisy classroom with lots of things going on, this is where your student is going to get lost. But putting them in a quiet, self-contained, one-on-one classroom, it is a completely different situation. So those are the questions that we need to ask for students who are hard of hearing and they do not yet have an interpreter in place. Now, I love a sign language interpreter and I love the use of sign language, but so often we forget that portion about teaching your student how to use sign in the first place. It can happen simultaneously when an interpreter is put in place, but it cannot happen on its own without having that opportunity for that direct instruction to learn. There are other ways that you can get your student access. You can give them peers, friends that sign. I love Deaf Camp. Sign language classes in person, of course, are amazing. But these days, there are tons of options to do them virtually as well. And of course, you've got a teacher of the deaf that can pour in. And you can also have that interpreter provide those little lessons, instruction, and even just conversational chat time that would help your student learn sign language. But the trick to doing this is it has to be done with their voice off. It has to be done in silence. You cannot have a person talking and signing at the same time and expect for your student to learn the signing along with it. Because again, they're going to lean into that auditory access if they have it. The best way to do this is to provide signing, no voice. Provide the word, provide the sign, and be able to support them in that way. Okay, so that's the first scenario. Let's talk about the second scenario. And I hear this one over and over again too. This is the student who has a sign language interpreter, but they don't look at that sign language interpreter, and the interpreter feels like they're not using me. The teachers, the deaf is saying they're not using that interpreter, and the school is saying we are paying a lot of money for this interpreter, and they are not even accessing this person at all. We need to pull the interpreter and use our resources a different way. Okay, so in this situation, again, we've got to go back to that original question. Can the student access what they're learning through listening only? And if they cannot, we cannot just automatically pull the interpreter unless we are ready to put some other support systems in place. If you're going to pull the interpreter, then you've got to, again, consider captioning. You've got to consider that quiet environment. You've got to consider another way for your student to be able to access their instruction. Now, when it comes to the use of the interpreter, we go right back to this conversation that we just had and ask the question, have the supports been put in place to help the student utilize the sign language interpreter? So question number one, do they even know sign language? Have the supports been put in place for them to learn this language? Okay. Question number two is, can they access the interpreter? Let's evaluate the environment of the classroom and see if they actually are accessing the interpreter without looking directly at the interpreter, because they do not necessarily need to be staring at the interpreter all day long to be accessing the interpreter. Ideally, the best placement for an interpreter is in the same visual fields as the teacher and whatever is happening in the classroom. So often I see students and I see the interpreter that's parked right in front of the student, and the student doesn't want to be staring at that interpreter because they're missing everything that's going on in the classroom. So they want to actually be watching the teacher and everything that's happening in the classroom, and they want to be able to see the interpreter, which they would look at for clarification when needed. The best situation is when that student can view the interpreter and the teacher and everything that the teacher is teaching all within the same visual field. If they have to move their head from one place to the other to be able to see both people, then that means that interpreter is not in an ideal placement. So that means the student maybe needs to come back, the interpreter needs to move forward, but we want to make sure that student can view the interpreter simply by moving their eye gaze. Okay? The next question that we need to ask is, has the student ever been taught how to use an interpreter and how to use this support system as a tool to support them in their success? I actually created an entire lesson and an entire unit on teaching this skill to students inside the Professional Academy. It was created specifically for this, to teach students how to access and utilize this tool, because they may not know how to use it naturally. They may need this little bit of instruction to understand how to use the interpreter for clarification, the role of the interpreter, what the interpreter does and what the interpreter doesn't. It often has to be taught. We cannot assume that a student will pick up on these skills naturally. If it is deemed that your student does not understand sign language, the first thing that you need to do is make sure that they've got an opportunity to learn sign language. And this can be done in summer programs. This can be done through online programs. This can be done through peers. Today, we talked about two things: how to identify if a student who does not have an interpreter needs an interpreter, and if they do have an interpreter, if that interpreter needs to be pulled. If they do not have this opportunity, then we need to identify what other ways are they going to be able to access their education. There is not an option to not give them access. You have to give them access. And maybe it's time to have some hard conversations about what this might look like for your student. I hope this video has been helpful for you. Make sure to check out the online Itinerant and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more tips for working with deaf and hard of hearing students in the classroom.